you so much for watching, listening. Totally stoked that you're joining today. And of course, we're continuing our series on recovering from trauma. Before we jump into the series, hello, I know you want these amazing jokes, tongue in cheek. Hey, did you hear the joke about the wandering nun? She was a Roman Catholic. You're like, oh my gosh. I know, I just went there. You're like, that's really fascinating. You have that kind of courage or stupidity to do such a poor joke. Okay. But we're doing part 3 in our series of recovering from trauma. And we're looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan, because the crux of the whole parable revolves around a guy who experiences trauma. And trauma can be abandonment, trauma can be abuse, and trauma can have sexual overtones to it as well. It can be physical, it can be verbal, it can be emotional, all kinds of ways that we experience trauma. But in this parable, we're looking at each individual, because there's 6 people in this parable, and we're looking at the possibility that we could be, have been, or might be one or all of these individuals. So last week we looked at the dude who is traveling, and we're walking in our journey of life. We looked at the bandits last week, and we looked at the possibility that maybe we have hurt people on purpose, accidentally, whatever. But today we're going to look at the priest and the Levite, because again, in this parable, there's 6 people. The journey, the traveler, the bandit, the priest, the Levite, the Good Samaritan, and then the innkeeper. So today is the priest and the Levite. And we read about them in Luke 10, verses 31 to 32. And it says, by chance, a priest was going down the road, and he saw the victim, the guy who got beat up, and he passed by on the other side. And then it says the Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. So the priest and the Levite. Interesting to think about these individuals, because at this time in Israel, Jewish history, a priest was responsible, was kind of, if we had to make a modern equivalent, it would be similar to what we know as a pastor, or some of us have priests in our churches, but it's a leader. It's the person who is kind of oversees the congregation, the worship, the way we honor and receive and connect with God. It can be, a priest can facilitate community, can give sermons, can provide leadership, a pastor. And there are people who have been great pastors and some not so good. But in this parable, a priest walks and sees the dude that's all beat up, broken, who's totally half dead on the Jericho road. He sees him and he keeps walking. I think that's really interesting, because as a leader, as a Christian leader, a pastor, you'd think that we would want to help somebody. We would want to stop and to be compassionate and to have a passion, a heart for people who are broken, who are hurting. But sometimes, if you're like me, there have been pastors in your life that weren't necessarily very pastoral. And it's interesting because we give titles to people. We call them pastor. But pastor, and I remember growing up, my dad was a pastor, and a lot of people said he was the quintessential pastor. He was very shepherdly, cared about his flock, his congregation. And he would look and he would know your cousins and your relatives, and he would talk, and he was very pastoral, concerned about people. And I remember meeting a pastor in Wales, and he said, a pastor should smell like sheep, because they're supposed to be shepherds. But there are times in our lives, as we've gone through Christianity and gone through our journey with God, that people who were leaders were supposed to be pastoral, care and nurture and look after and help us grow and discipleship and gentle and affirming and not just that, but also helping us with truth and to be growing and maturing. But there are people in our Christian walk that have not been that. I had a pastor in my life, and he was anything but pastoral. He was everything unkind, revolting. In fact, I know most of the people who came to experience Jesus or came to hear of Jesus under his leadership, they walked away from Jesus because he was everything but pastoral. He was awful. And then when you think about the Levite, and that's what this priest was, he just kept walking. You think about the Levite. A Levite isn't necessarily the same level as a priest, but a Levite was responsible for the functions, for practical things, looking after, making sure supplies were met, making sure the temple was cleaned up, making sure the synagogue had the resources, everything was organized and structured, put together. Kind of like a deacon, an usher, a greeter in the church, you know, somebody who stuffs the envelopes in the back of the pews. Just a Levite, somebody who's doing kind of real practical stuff. And the Levite saw, and he kept walking. And it's interesting because if we get so heavy into religion that we neglect people, then we've kind of got things a little topsy-turvy. And I know sometimes I've wanted, out of my own insecurity, I've wanted to be important, you know, and I'm not going to get dirty, get my hands messy, or get involved with people and all of their garbage, because I don't want to, you know, and there was a time in my life when I was like, ugh, you know, I don't want to get unclean. I don't want to pollute myself with all of their issues. And why do we do these things? Why are we cold? Why are we indifferent? Why are we detached? Why can we observe without compassion? I think there's a lot of reasons, but we have to be careful in our own souls and our own hearts that we see people and we don't just see the trauma, because when all you see is trauma, then look, you know, it's like run for the exit because it's yucky. But we see past the trauma and we see the person. Let's not be so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good. Let's not be indifferent. Let's not be uncaring. Let's not be so pious and righteous that we can't get into the muck and help people, humans. I love what my dad said. I'm just one beggar showing another beggar where there's bread. It's what he always said about Jesus, about the Bible, about church. And so let's be careful in our own hearts, in our own minds, in our souls, the attitude, outlook that we have, that we're not the priest and the Levite, and we see brokenness and we see people who've been traumatized and we just keep walking because we lack compassion. That's got to be a really core thing for us. And if we have been abandoned and left, and if somebody has hurt us, a pastor has hurt, rejected, or not given us what we need, not been compassionate, then let's walk in forgiveness. And let's realize that everybody's human, flawed, makes mistakes, and let's be generous with forgiveness because we desperately need it ourselves. So thank you so much for listening, watching. Thank you for subscribing. Hit the notification bell right there and keep you posted when we put up new content. And here's a question for you to think about. I want you to answer this in the comments right here. Who has been your favorite pastor and why? Who has been your favorite pastor and why? All right, keep watching because next week we're gonna wrap up this series and finish it with some really cool people, kind of on the high note of heroic activities. Thanks so much.